Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute of Policy Studies Post-Election Conference 2015, where we analyze the outcome of the general election that was held on the 11th of September. We have invited thought leaders as well as representatives of Singapore's political parties to discuss what the general election means for political development in Singapore, as well as its ramifications for the policy agenda of the country beyond our Golden Jubilee year. Our first session will see speakers share with you the findings of 2 IPS surveys on the general election. The data from these surveys have been provided for you for your reference and your attention. The session will be chaired by Dr. Mathews, Senior Research Fellow at IPS and Head of its Society and Identity Research Cluster. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. Mathews to get the ball rolling.
Hi, good morning to all of you, and it's great that so many people have turned up this morning. It's been 8 weeks, nearly 8 weeks since the September 11th general election, and it was the first election for quite a while where every seat has been contested. After the 2011 election, which many commentators dubbed as the new normal in terms of the results, most have expected that the PAP's vote share would have declined further. There are some good reasons for that, potentially one, the fact that more of the post-65 generation is voting, and also the fact that the opposition is a lot more confident in terms of their ability to govern. But I think many people all those who place their bets probably were very disappointed because the results clearly showed the PAP regaining substantial ground in this election. All of us have probably analyzed the results of the election. We have talked to our 5 good friends in our very homogeneous social circles, and we have come up with a slew of reasons of why the PAP and the opposition have performed the way they performed. My colleagues, Prof. Tan and Dr. Gillian Koh, and also later Dr. Carol Soon and Mr. Tana Hao, they've had the good fortune of being able to aggregate the results of many Singaporeans. So it's not the 5 close social friends, close friends in your social circle, but thousands of Singaporeans in a variety of surveys. And they're able to give us some analysis of some of the main trends in terms of voter patterns and what was key election issues and what were things that prompted people to vote the way they did. Hopefully after we hear that, we'll probably be able to have a lot more of a discussion which is ground up, where we consider how general Singaporeans are thinking about the issue. So I won't take a lot longer to introduce the subject. We have 2 very eminent researchers and also public intellectuals. You have on my right, Professor Tan and Sir, who is a sociologist based at the Department of Sociology and also more recently at the Institute of Policy Studies, and Dr. Gillian Koh, a senior fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. Both of them, their views are regularly sought during the election season and after the election season, so we'd love to hear some of your thoughts. So let's start with Dr. Gillian Koh. Welcome.
Good morning. It's my great pleasure to share with you the data from the 3rd wave of the IPS Post-Election Survey. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this is work by not just myself, but Associate Professor Tan and Sir, as well as Research Associate at IPS, Ms. Debbie Soon. And the field work was done by Degree Census, a survey firm that was commissioned to poll 2,000 Singapore citizens of voting age through a phone poll. Okay, so this is what I will go through in my 20 minutes. I will talk about the research background, a little bit about methodology, but you have the full details in your handbook, some of the key highlights of the findings, and then a very special part of our survey data, which is what we call the cluster analysis, and then finally I will conclude. As I shared just now, this is the third wave of the post-election survey. It's part of what we call the POPs series of surveys at IPS. These are quick snapshot views of Singaporean sentiments with regard to policy or political changes. The first survey was done after the 2006 general election. It polled just under 1,000 people in what we call a quota sample. So its findings are indicative of what is the sentiment, but not generalizable to the population. Then the second survey was done in 2011 after the GE. It polled 2,000 citizens of voting age using the landline. They were randomly selected, and therefore the data is deemed to be generalizable to the population. And that is the same with the third wave. And really we're looking at the insights that a study like that will offer of Singaporeans and the political attitudes and ideals they hold. And as a think tank, and with somebody who only has 18 minutes on the clock, I think what we want to focus on is the vectors of change. Where is change coming from? So just a recap of what we found in 2011. First, we found, as in 2006, that political ideals matter when it comes to the issues that shape voters' decision in the ballot box. But in 2011, the cost of living issue popped up to rank second among the top 5, and especially for those in the higher white-collar jobs called the service class, and voters in those age groups you see on the screen now. The second is that we saw a clearer distinction in voter attitudes between those who are in the pre-independence generation versus those in the post-65 generation. Third, that candidates' moral virtues and their social abilities, and as well as their efficiency, mattered much more than their credentials, their grassroots experience, or, surprisingly, their party affiliation. Next, we found that the internet had become more influential vis-a-vis 2006, and that we then were able to nail down to some of the voter segments that shifted in their support for the PAP, as well as shifted in their outlook in terms of supporting certain political ideals that reinforce political competition in Singapore. And you see the segments on the screen. So, what were the burning questions of the 2015 survey? First, where did the key segments that shifted support towards greater political pluralism in 2011 stand in 2015? Second, is that desire for political pluralism still closely related to socio-economic class, which is what we found in the last two waves. The higher the socio-economic class, the more likely that voter is going to support the ideal of having political competition in Singapore. Third, what are the desired qualities in candidates? Fourth, what was the impact of the internet? And fifth, were there any specific issues related to being in the year 2015 that mattered to voters when they went to the ballot box? So now, you must be thinking, what is all that jumbo mumbo? Well, how do we explain the swing towards the PAP of 9.8% on the 11th of September? What about the performance of the Workers' Party, which is the leading opposition party? Even though they have recaptured the 6 seats that they had after 2011, we know that their fortunes seem to have dimmed somewhat, and they lost 1 seat that they had won in a by-election in 2013. Then what of the fate of the minor opposition parties? So a quick download on our key findings. On the first question, yes, some key segments that shifted away from supporting the PAP and towards political pluralism did change as well in 2015. Yes, the relationship between the support for political pluralism is still closely tied to socioeconomic class, but there is a caveat that on the whole lot of respondents are shifting more towards supporting the ideal of political pluralism. Next, in the desired qualities in candidates that voters are looking for, no change. The impact of the internet, well, our finding is it did not erode the role of mainstream media. And finally, were there issues that were specific to 2015 that mattered? Yes, there were, but only to specific groups of people. So, now to the key findings of our survey, and I take you through some of the key data, and I'll also just explain quickly how to read it because you have the full set on your tables. First section of our survey has to do with issues. So we ask our respondents, I'm going to list you 18 issues. Please tell me if you strongly agree, you're neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree that issue X mattered deeply to you when you voted. So we've listed 18. We've included some that we thought were relevant for the year 2015, but what we're trying to do is to capture whether changes have been taking place with regard to some key issues, those related to political ideals. What did we find? First, that the amount of government help for needy, which was a new item, popped up as second ranking in the stacking order of the 18 issues. Second, that the need for different views in Parliament dropped to being ranked 8 by mean score, but the percentage of those agreeing it was important has increased. And remember, we are trying to hone in on the issue of need for different views in Parliament as a proxy for support for political pluralism. So if you scan through the data that you have on hand, what you have are bar charts that show you the findings for the 3 years. And you see up there the need for good and efficient government, amount for government help for the needy, third, fairness for government policy, fourth, cost of living, and then we found our item titled Need for Checks and Balances in Parliament, ranking 5 by the mean score. But in all these charts, you can see that the sections that mark out the neutral response are disappearing. People are taking a clearer stand as to whether they agree or disagree to certain items. So that's our perennial item there, need for checks and balances. And as you scroll down, you see that ranked 8 is need for different views in Parliament, but you also see that there is an increase up to 86% for those who say that it was a very important issue to them as they thought about their vote. I will highlight some of the other key findings. We segment the data and find out the segments of people for whom these issues matter the most. And so you have a list in your handbooks for efficient government. It matters for everyone, but especially for the service class and those who are higher educated. And for each of these segments, you can trust that these are statistically significant findings. We don't highlight anything that isn't statistically significant. So you see the details for the rest of the items. But on need for checks and balances, you see that these were particularly important for those in the 30 to 39 age group, for Malays and Indians. As for need for different views in Parliament, you see that's especially the case for the youngest set of voters. Now to the 2015 issues, we listed the LKY legacy among the 18 issues, and the LKY legacy came up to be especially important for the older set of voters, for those with secondary and below education, those in the working class with humbler backgrounds. And that was the same profile for the question of AHPETC. But we recognize that not all the voters across Singapore might have felt that this was an important issue. But what we provide are the segments of respondents for whom this was particularly important. So that's the first set of questions or issues, first set of questions focused on issues in our survey. The second set has to do with qualities of candidates for which there was no change. Not much change. We recognize that there is a slight difference in the percentages of respondents agreeing that a candidate's party matters. So if you look at the bottom set of data and you look at the light blue and dark blue bars, you see how they have increased in length over time. Now to the third section of our data, which looks at communication channels. So we ask our respondents which were the communication channels that mattered to you most when you thought about your vote. Okay? So we gave them a list. Again, we take them through a whole list, and they are supposed to tell us if they found it important or not important or neutral or not, so on and so forth. So they tell us how it was relevant to them. And we found that TV became most important in our rank of channels. Print newspapers and internet share the same second mark or rank. And you have the data in your handbook, but there it is. You'll see that local TV coverage, of which there was much more in 2015, popping up there by mean score, but also you can see the support or the recognition that it was important by the light and dark blue bars. When respondents said that the internet was important to them, we asked them which were the platforms that were important, and you see that Facebook comes up first. But we recognize that Facebook is also a segue into many other platforms. But there it is, Facebook first, and then YouTube and CNA website. Now to the fourth section of our survey, where we ask respondents whether they strongly disagree, they're neutral, agree or strongly agree that Party X is credible. And we take them through 6 items for 6 parties. What we found was the credibility standing of the PAP increased, as well as for the SDP. WP maintained its mean score, but more agreed that it was credible. So let me show you the data. And if you turn your eye to, cast your eye to the WP data, you'll see that the light blue and the dark blue bars have lengthened, and you'll see the increase in support. The PAP was credible, especially with the older voters, those with PSLE and below education, females and naturalized citizens. For the WP and SDP, the profile for those who said that these parties were particularly credible was the same. Post-independence younger voters, people in the service, the higher service class, with higher education, and guys. Don't know why. The other opposition parties were deemed more credible by these segments of people, the younger voters and those in the low middle income group. And some of you will be wondering which of the naturalized citizens found that the PAP was especially credible, and we've given you the segments there. Though this data is not statistically significant, the differences are not statistically significant, you'll find that in the box on the right-hand side, that it's those who have been here those who have become citizens for the shortest amount of time and the longest amount of time, particularly supportive of the PAP. We've given you segments for where the leaps in support came about. It was across the board for the PAP, but you see the segments for the PAP there, which tend to be the very young, the very old, and those from humbler backgrounds, and the Chinese. We've done the same for the WP, and the leaps in support came from the youngest voters, or youngest respondents, and Malays. And for the SDP, then it's those between 21 and 39, the minorities, the people with post-secondary and university education, and those in the service class. We have a fifth section in our survey, which has various miscellaneous items, but they're particularly important for the final set of data I'm going to show you. We use them in what we call the cluster analysis. The cluster analysis is a staple in our IPS post-election survey, and basically what happens is a statistical package clusters the respondents based on their answers to 5 statements. In the first 2 surveys, we used 6 statements. The statement that we've thrown out in this year's survey is the one, votes for upgrading is unfair, right? So we've thrown that out because we recognize the parties didn't go full out to campaign on the issue of votes for upgrading. You have the statements there, so let me describe the clusters. The clusters place respondents based on their orientation towards political change and voice. So the Conservatives are supportive of, when we looked at what the statistical package threw up, the first category of respondents were, when we looked at their responses to the 5 items, were more supportive of the political status quo and cooler to change. No need to change the election system. Certainly, everything is as it should be. When we looked at the second cluster that the statistical package threw up, and we termed them pluralists, the responses of the respondents in these clusters tended to be answering those 5 questions in a way that suggested that they were more supportive of greater political competition, checks and balances in our political system, and they were therefore warmer towards political change. And then there's a third category we call swing, for want of a better label, and these are people with eclectic views. So what did we find? I should mention that these positions are all relative to one another. They're not sort of hard and fast, and I will emphasize that in the next minute or so. But the overview is that this was the picture in 2006, and you see that 33.6 of our respondents then were in what we call the pluralist box. And in 2011, there was a mark up towards 35.8% of our respondents in the pluralist box. And look, in 2015, we only have 18% of our respondents who qualify to be in that pluralist box. But here's the caveat. When we looked at even the conservative box, which are people who are less or more comfortable with status quo, we found that they are still shifting slightly towards supporting the idea that it's important to have an elected opposition party representation in Parliament. Look again at the answer to the statement, need for checks and balances in Parliament. And you can see that even what has been categorized as being in the Conservative box, still there are people who are more appreciative than before of the need for checks and balances in Parliament. And that's the same for the need for different views in Parliament as well. So that's our caveat. The long and short of it is that I think on a whole, what our data suggests is that Singaporeans are moving towards recognizing the need for greater transparency and accountability in political competition. But those who are dyed-in-the-wool pluralists, those who hold it as an ideal that under all circumstances We must have that political competition as a governance ideal. Those who qualify to be in that box has shrunk. Okay? So there are two different findings in that sense. What we've done is to give you the segments for age and class. And basically, if you look at the data and you look at the red line, follow the red line, that will tell you what are the trends in terms of support for pluralism. Let me pull it out quickly. And you see that it is really the youngest who support greater pluralism, although they follow the national trend of being less so. And you have the same data for class. And let me just take you through this one more slide. What we've done is to highlight, say, housing type. And again, you see that in general, there's a national slide down in terms of support for pluralism. But you'll always see that those in the higher socioeconomic classes are always on top versus the rest. You see that for private housing, you see that for the upper professional classes, you see that for household income, and you see that for education. So my time has come to an end, and let me just quickly conclude. What we found was that there was a shift towards supporting the PAP from our credibility data and also from our cluster analysis towards what we call conservative, being conservative or supporting the political status quo. And these are the segments. Relating back to 2011, you see that the youngest and the oldest voters have popped back up towards finding PAP being credible and towards supporting conservatism or shifting away from what we call pluralism. And you find the other segments there, especially those who are living in four-room flats. Second, the desire for political pluralism is still closely related to socio-economic class, that with each step up the rung in socio-economic class, the support for pluralism rises. But the absolute level of support is conditional and can fall. So we have dyed-in-the-wool pluralists, and we have conditional pluralists, and that's where policy and performance of the governing party can make a difference. Ideals matter, but so do materialist and practical concerns. So we saw in our list of issues that the practical concerns matter, especially to the HDB 1 to 4 room flat dwellers. So the question is, have the reforms in public policy since 2011, changing the government's social compact with citizens, with its special focus on the poor, right up to the lower middle class and the elderly, provided the PAP with that political bounce we see in our data and certainly in the outcome of GE 2015. Also, with the younger segment, then our data provides no clear indication of what shifted them, but the question is whether the focus on policies related to educational and career opportunities, the idea that the PAP stands for a continuous meritocracy and translating that to the ground mattered for this segment of voters. Will this change in voter attitudes continue? Will that percentage of being in the pluralist cluster be maintained, or will it be reduced? And what would its impact be on our political system? The opposition parties receive their main support from the younger and better educated. What can they do to respond to these findings? And the next question is, even those in the conservative cluster are moving towards supporting the need for diverse and opposition voice and checks and balances. So again, what does that mean for political opposition? Surely they shouldn't be in the blues. They should recognize that there is a vein of support for the ideal of having a political opposition in Singapore and take advantage of that. The qualities of integrity and being fair-minded are still important. That we also found that the use of the internet and social media have not displaced the role of mainstream media, and mainstream media has in fact done quite a lot to catch up and be relevant and be present in social media as well. So this is some recognition of that effort. Naturalized citizens are more likely to be in the conservative cluster and supportive of the PAP. That is true. And so I think with those questions, I think I'll just end here as my time is more than over, and hand the mic back to our very patient chairperson, Mathew. Thank you, Mathew.
Thank you very much, Gillian. There's a lot of food for thought from that session. We now have Professor Tanan Sir to provide us his analysis.
Okay, maybe I'll ask our friend to set it up, and then while he's setting up, I will just get started. All right, this morning when I came early, I thought I should just do a bit of sense making, right, to find out whether the ground is sweet or not, you know. And it turned out that it's quite sweet, actually. I met my friend, the bishop, and asked him to pray for me, and he said, okay, right? And also I met my teacher, Gillian, who has always been very supportive of me all these years. So I hope that I will not disappoint her. Okay, anyway, today I'm going to report on the survey that we did over the election period. We did 3 waves primarily, okay? That means just before nomination day, and then from nomination day and after, and then from polling day and after. So within a period of 1 month, we did 3 waves, and we had 3,000 cases. The questionnaire involved is essentially quite similar, except that for the last wave, we also asked people who they voted for. And you know that Singaporeans are quite reticent about telling us who they voted for, right? So for that question, in fact, we have something like a 55% response rate. And so I had to do a bit of checking out the data, and I found that actually it's quite reliable, even though it's only 55%. So I'm going to report that, but you know, as in all data analysis, there will always be some kind of limitation. And anyway, I'm quite glad that we are in good company here, because I'm sure among you, all of us are post hoc theories, right? Isn't it? We all look at the results and then we work backward and say, aha, I think it's because Singaporeans are afraid of a freak election. And then maybe because the Workers' Party is coming on too strong, you know. So those are all kinds of reasons that we offer to theorize about the outcome of GE 2015. I'm going to do a bit somewhat similar thing, you know, involving intellectual leap and all that, but I'm going to do it with some data, all right? And of course, even with data don't always tell you the whole story, so we need to fill it in between, all right? So whatever it is, please be nice when you're asking questions later on. Okay, and then being a sociologist, of course, I got to start off with something theoretical, right? And so I decided to use somebody that I met in Michigan, Ronald Inglehart. And he was saying that, you know, as society become more affluent and more developed, right, people tend to experience a fundamental shift in values and towards being more pro-democratic, okay? So I think to a large extent, I think Singapore seems to have experienced that in the last 30 years, 20 to 30 years. And then one of the things that happened in this fundamental shift of value is that there's a declining respect for authority and a growing emphasis on participation and self-expression. And I just want to say that it's more likely to be more elite, challenging, issue-oriented, and also a more direct form of democracy. So in other words, the big thing is that with economic development and affluence, we are likely to find that people are more inclined towards democracy, towards participation, and then in our case, we capture it in terms of the need or the support for political pluralism. All right, that's how we, the indicator that we use. And then I also use some ideas from my friend from Taiwan. And essentially the argument is that, you know, people believe in democracy. All right, they want all the good things about democracy, they embrace it. But at the same time, democracy, the second point, we have a hard time winning people's hearts if regimes are able to deliver social stability and economic development. So in short, it is about survival, that means bread and butter issues are still with us, versus democracy, which is, in our case, political pluralism. And I also want you to note that the late 20th century is also characterized by economic insecurity. So in other words, even though we talked about prosperity earlier, but I think economic insecurity hasn't gone away from us yet. So, from that, I will launch into my this sort of theoretical understanding of the timeline and the period in Singapore over the last 50 years. I would argue that the 60s and 70s were the time when we talk a lot about survival, and Chan Heng-chi talked about survival ideology, and that produces the sort of pragmatism of the PAP and all those things that the PAP has been able to deliver during that period of time. And then the 70s and the early 80s, I call that the golden years, the golden age of Singapore. And that's the time when we talk about the Singapore dream a lot. And we talk about the 5 Cs, we talk about upgrading. And then what happened in the late 80s and the early 2000s is that we have all the financial crises, we have the September 11, SARS, and things like that. So things are beginning to unravel the Singapore dream that people are becoming more comfortable with and more familiar with. But I would say that during those 3 decades, essentially the outcome, election outcome will be that we have a one-party dominance. And again, this is what Prof. Chan Heng-chi has spoken at length and written about too. So let me move on quickly to 2011 and 2015, right? I would say that 2011, we are still in the age of the period where people feel that, there's prosperity, the 5 Cs and upgrading, right? But then came the hot button issues, about transport, about housing affordability, and so on and so forth. And then also, at the same time, the WP was seen as a credible opposition. And then I think there's also this greater support for political pluralism. And the outcome in 2011 was a watershed election and also the so-called emerging of the new normal. And then now let's talk about 2015. I would argue that 2015, right, we are not going into a period of more prosperity. In fact, I would say that we are now entering a period where survival ideology is coming back again. All right, it may not be the same survival ideology that we had in the 60s and the 70s, but I will call it the version 2. All right, because now we start from a higher base, but the world has become a lot more difficult, more complex, and also, look at it, there's global competition, and we talk a lot about trade outs nowadays, so life is not easy. And then this survival ideology at the same time is also reinforced by SG50 because we look back at the past and say, hey, we have gone through so many struggles, we can't take things for granted. And then, of course, the LKY legacy that we are all very familiar during the last few months. But generally, I would argue that, the ground is sweeter, but the hot button issues still remain. Okay, and I also want to argue that I think Singaporeans are becoming a lot more future-oriented, but at the same time, the support for political pluralism hasn't quite declined. And then my takeaway point, apart from this thing about survival ideology, is that I think the people believe that, that what really matters is that there must be confidence in the party that you vote for, the confidence and the reputation of the party. So let me now go into the data that I have. As I said, there'll be some intellectual leap here and there, right? So there might be gaps. In the survey that we did, we actually look at 4 areas. One is satisfaction with government performance, and then, of course, the issues which influence how Singaporeans voted. And then we also look at governance broadly and views on electoral system, life satisfaction, and then finally, in wave 3, we ask people who they voted for and whether the campaign has any impact on the decisions that they make. So let me go on to I think I'll skip these questions. Methodology, I already mentioned, and we had 3 waves, and the fieldwork was done by YouGov using an internet platform. I think internet platform allow us to do things very fast, because if you do face-to-face, you do door knocking, it'll take you forever. By the time we give the result, the war is over, right? So we don't want that to happen. So we used an online platform. Okay, let me introduce a few results. I'm not going to go through the whole laundry list. We actually asked people whether they are highly satisfied or not satisfied with government performance on 28 items. So I'll just highlight the top 5 and the bottom 5. As you can see, the top 5, right, these are all relating to management issue, management of the economy, management of society. And by the way, the scale, we're talking about a scale of 1 to 9. So 7 point something is certainly above average. So my conclusion here is government rated higher on management of society and followed by economy. What about the other side? The least satisfied one, okay? This sort of square with Gillian's data as well. Cost of living is the lowest. Inequality, ministerial salary, although I didn't hear that much during the campaign period. Housing affordability and immigration policy. So these are at the low end, the items in which people are least satisfied. So question here is, do these matter? And I'll say that they still do matter. I did some analysis by class and by age, but I don't think I want to belabor this point too much. But just to say that the higher classes tend to have higher rating on government performance in how the PAP government manage society. And I also noticed that the older ones are older in the sense of near elderly, right, 55 to 64, also have a higher rating on government performance in managing society. Okay, what about the issues which influence how Singaporeans voted? And you will notice that, even though these are the issues that were actually, the least satisfied, but they are most influential. So cost of living, in fact, 64, about 2/3 of our respondents say that it influenced their decision. So cost of living, housing affordability, healthcare, retirement adequacy, and government transparency and accountability. These are the hot button issues of 2011, and they still matter in 2015. All right, and these are the least influential issues. Increasing birth rate, looks like fertility is not really up there. Crisis management, relations between races, childcare, and then civil rights and liberty. So these are not the hot one, okay? So the highest scoring issues rank low in terms of influence on decision making. Okay, I think I'll just skip this, but I just want to just point to the third point rather, that I noticed that even though, we always talk about the young people, right? But I think the people who are really most affected are those in age 30 to 39. These are the people who are just setting up home. And so they are the ones who feel that, housing affordability, healthcare affordability. In fact, I think the 20 to 29 seems to be quite happy in terms of life satisfaction. And then as for the age 40 to 54, right, I would argue that most of them belong to the sandwich generation, meaning they have to take care of their parents as well as school-going kids. So there's a lot of pressure from the generation on top and the generation below them. Okay, views on governance. Well, what do I really mean by governance? I mean, governance is actually, you can look at it as having 3 parts, right? The inputs to the political process, and then the throughput, and then, of course, the output, right? So we ask people whether the government does right for Singapore, government policies are fair, government does a good job in stating the rationale, in communicating the reasons and all that. And the feeling I get is that the scores are somewhat around the midpoint on a scale of 1 to 9. So they are not really up there. I mean, they are positive, but they are not really up there. So I'm not sure whether they really matter in GE 2015 or not. All right, what about the views on governance by class and age? Well, again, I don't want to go through every point, but just to also say that age 30 to 39, there seems to be a lower scores for governance. So maybe this is actually the age category to watch out for, rather than the very young, the very old. Okay, what about electoral system? Some of these questions are quite similar to those of Gillian's. Like, for example, we talk about whether should there be political diversity in parliament, and all things considered, whether our electoral system works well for Singapore or not. And again, you notice that they're not very high, not very low also. It's about somewhere in the middle. And I just want to point out there's a higher support for political pluralism, as you can see in this table. Okay, again, let me point to age 30 to 39. They score lower on views on the electoral system. All right, life satisfaction. We asked our respondents, right, whether they're satisfied 5 years ago, whether they're satisfied currently, at present, and whether they think they'll be satisfied, 5 years from now, right? And again, you notice that on a scale of 1 to 9, we get something about 5 to 6. So it's not exactly very high. It's not unhappy, but it's not extremely happy either. All right, so also to point out, younger, more satisfied, younger meaning age 20 to 29. The higher educated, housing type, also a higher satisfaction. All right, so there's a class effect there, as you can see. Okay, I think this is to me, it's a highlight. The party voted for. And, well, according to the response we get is that I think about 4.4% did not vote. I don't know how that's squared with the actual figure. So about majority did vote. And I want you to look at the table just below, right? You notice that, in fact, we sort of predicted the election. And of course, we're not supposed to talk about it before, right? But anyway, we did this after the election, and this is what we found. 71% for the PAP, and close to 29% for the non-PAP parties. Okay, I don't think I want to dwell on this one. Let me move on to impact of party and election campaign, right? And what I would like to point out is that, look at the top three, right, is confidence in the party is number 1, 7.31, reputation of the party, and the need for opposition presence in parliament is 7.01. So those are to me, the heavy ones, all right, the heavy factors that have a serious impact on the decision that voters make. Okay, now I'm going to compare the two kinds of voters, the PAP voters and the non-PAP voters. And this is what I get. I mean, the numbers are actually quite self-explanatory, right? You notice that on everything, practically everything, there's an obvious difference between the PAP voters and the non-PAP voters. Let's look at the first one. I mean, law and order, PAP 7.52, non-PAP 6.21. And I've actually calculated the difference between the two scores. Although I should also point out that, I mean, generally, the satisfaction level, even for those who voted for non-PAP, is actually quite high, right? You still get your 6.21 and 6.18. So moving right along. What about the 5 top issues which influence how Singaporeans voted? This one, I think, both actually are quite low, right? You notice that the non-PAP, for example, cost of living is 2.81, is way below. And for the PAP voters, it's 4.73. It's still below the 5, the midpoint. Okay, so in other words, both are generally low, but the non-PAP voters are lower on the scale of 1 to 9. And the difference are quite big. For instance, talking about meeting retirement needs, we are talking about 2.12 difference between the PAP voters and the non-PAP voters. All right, here is a longer list. These are governance and electoral system. And again, you find PAP score higher than non-PAP voters. But let me just point out one in which the non-PAP voters actually score higher, which is the one about important to have political diversity in parliament. You notice that non-PAP is 7.21 and PAP is 6.67. But even so, both scores are pretty high, really. But it does suggest that the people who are more supportive of pluralism actually voted for non-PAP parties. All right, this one is not so interesting, but it just also say that people who are satisfied are more likely to vote for PAP, and then the rest, even as low as 3.79 for the non-PAP voters. And the difference are quite large, it's like 2.36 between PAP voters and non-PAP voters. And what about in terms of views on the election campaign? I want to point you to the last 3 again, because those, to me, are the most critical. The need for an opposition presence in parliament, you notice that for non-PAP is 7.99, is almost 8 out of 9, so pretty high, right? And then for reputation of the party, confidence in the party, those are very high scoring one. And you notice that both are actually quite similar. You notice that the difference are less than 1. It's 0.18, 0.49. And the way I see is that it does suggest some kind of polarization. In other words, the people who believes in opposition presence, reputation of the party, confidence in the party, they voted for what the party that they think they are most confident in, and that is not the PAP. Okay, I'm almost done. So just a quick point about differences across the 3 waves. We did 3 waves, but what we noticed is that actually there's only a slight decline across the waves, not much different from beginning to end. So the implication here, you may fault me on that, is that the campaign period seems to have minimal impact on the voter choice, at least over that the sort of 3 weeks period. Okay, I don't think I want to go through the summary because this is essentially what I've reported, but let me just go straight into the conclusion. The conclusion should tie in with what I say in my opening lines, which is that at the end of the day, the competition is between survival and political pluralism. And apparently, of course, I think my argument is that I think survival wins, except that now it comes back as survival ideology version 2. Okay, so the conclusion here, the hot button issues still matter, as you can see. I can't really tell if the ground is sweeter because I don't have, I can't compare, unlike Gillian, right, with 2006 and 2011. So, but generally, I think it's sweeter, but I can't prove it. There's the emergence of survival ideology version 2, and this is aided by SG50, LKY legacy, and of course the economic outlook that we know. I mean, you turn to the papers this morning, you notice one major bank is going to offload a lot of staff, and then there's also something said about the bleak outlook of manufacturing. So, I mean, come on. It's not that bright, economic outlook. Anyway, the last 2 points I want to make is that voters are more future-oriented, as indicated by confidence in the party they voted for. So it's not the nitty-gritty of item by item, right, but it's a general feeling of goodwill, of confidence, and of reputation. And then my last point, opposition has a foothold given the support for political pluralism. So it's not the end of the opposition. We had the watershed election, and it seems that they're here to stay. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Tan. We've been exposed to quite a bit of data this morning, and I'm sure that has whet your appetite to ask many questions pertaining to the data. So I'd like to ask you to restrict, we've got several panels here today, so could you restrict the questions that we have to the presentations which have been made and some of the thoughts that have come as Prof. Tan and Dr. Gillian Koh have surfaced their research findings. In the interest of the fact that many of you probably have burning questions, we'd like to collect a couple of questions and we'll ask the speakers to respond to them. So if you can proceed to the mic and Professor David Chan can start. And the rest, if you can get to the mic and yeah, gentleman there.
Can you hear me? Okay. It's a question, but I have to preface it with a comment. I think it's very good that Gillian released to us both the percentages and also the mean scores, because there's complete transparency in the data, and we can just interpret. Of course, the challenge is there is a lot of data and all, right? I also noticed that the conclusion was primarily made on the mean scores. I would just add that in most national surveys, it's quite useful to look at the percentages changes instead, because percentages has complete practical meaning of how many percent of people decided to do A instead of B, as opposed to the mean. The second related point is that the mean can be quite meaningless, and it could be misleading because it's one number that summarizes the changes of categories on 5 points. So here I thought it's quite important, especially since there's media reporting. On page 40, when we say the credibility of PAP, WP, and say SDP, I remember the conclusion on the slide was that PAP increased credibility the most. That was based on looking at the mean score. You moved from 3.9 to 4.2, 0.2. And then WP was 3.6, so you concluded that it was constant, and you concluded that SDP increased by 0.1. But if you look at the percentages, the conclusion is quite different. The conclusion will be that WP increased, for a percentage should say agree or disagree, actually increased from 2011 to 2015 by 15%. So they didn't remain constant. Their credibility increased. SDP increased the most by 22%, and then the PAP increased by 20%. So if I choose to look at the percentages, which I personally would, then I would conclude that PAP and SDP increased a lot, and they increase about the same. If you really want to go for it, then SDP is 22 and PAP is 20. But I will not conclude that SDP became much more credible than PAP, because PAP went up to 93%, you can't increase further, you cannot exceed 100, for example. And then in the case of SDP, they started with a very low base of 24, but they doubled to 46, right? So I think it's quite important to decide. That's the question, really, to decide when do you use the percentages, when to use the mean. Because one way is to be consistent and just use percentages or the mean. Or the other way is to make every conclusion caveated with that. Well, if you look at the mean, this is the conclusion. If you look at the percentages, this is the conclusion. So that's the main question. And if you allow me, I'll just finish up my question with the last point that WP and SDP, actually what should be of note in terms of future is that the percentage of neutral has gone down tremendously. It used to be 36% who are undecided if WP is credible. It has gone down to only 10% because they have decided to either they are credible or not credible, and it's split quite evenly. And in the case of SDP, also 50%, and then they decided they form an opinion now about SDP, and it went down to only 11% neutral. Meaning that in the two main opposition parties, there are less fence-sitters about their credibility. In the case of PAP, it's not surprising. Those who are 20% not decided, they like the policy or whatever, and then they decided that PAP is credible. So I thought that kind of interpretation is quite important. As I can imagine, tomorrow's headline will say PAP has increased the highest credibility. It might be good to consider the headline reporters. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Gentlemen, yeah. Yeah, gentleman first. Then, can you just let the gentleman speak first? Excuse me. Oh, can you have the gentleman first, and then is all right? Okay.
And thank you very much for this gentleman for fixing the mic and also allowing me to go first. I am going first not because I'm a lady or a female, but because I wanted to follow up on Professor Chan's points, which I absolutely agree with. I think it's very important not just to have a mean, but to show the standard deviations and the distribution. Especially, I think there would be some interesting findings for Professor Tan's papers on governance, life satisfaction, because the means, as you have shown, are pretty mean, pretty much in the middle. But it would be very interesting to see how extreme some of, say, life satisfaction or governance, what the two ends are like. The other point I also wanted to jump on Professor Chan's bandwagon is on the credibility of political parties, as he has already, and so I won't go into detail, shown, depending on how you look at the figures, you could say that SDP has done the best in terms of increasing their ranking. What I'm interested in is, I wonder how many of these people have you know, if you have overlapped in terms of their assessment of credibility, because you could have the same person saying that PAP, WP, and SDP is credible. They might just be more gullible. And whether for the same reason, those who have said non-credible might be the same people. So I wonder if Gillian could enlarge on that. Thank you.
Let's do the methodological questions first, and since we need to get them off. So the issue about using means versus percentages.
Hi, good morning. I'm Sui Yong from Century 21. My question is also about methodology. I am wondering whether for Dr. Koh, were the surveys all done purely in English, or did you include dialects? Did you include all the 4 major languages? And for Prof. Tan, I guess because the survey was done through the internet, I assume English is the medium. And so both sets of survey results, are they really representative of the entire voting population, or should we say that they are just representative of maybe 60% of the 2.4 million voters? I have actually got this question all the time when I read anything from SPH research or any researchers, because I am very sure there are about 20% of the voting population, 22 maybe, according to the 2014 stats, that are above 60 years old, who may not be able to understand the context of your surveys even. So how applicable is this to the voting population? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so let's hear some thoughts on methodology. Gillian, you want to start off?
Okay. First off, we're very grateful to have Dr. David Chan or Professor Chan in the house today. Thank you very much for your clarification. I think that if you look on slide 39, we tried to, to be as brief as possible, but to highlight that we consider not just the mean scores, but the percentages. So there you have it. WP maintained its mean score, but more said that they agreed that it was credible. And that's just brevity. You're absolutely right. As you look and you calculate the changes in the percentages of our respondents saying that they strongly agree or agree that the top 3 parties are credible, then this is how it stacks up. As Prof. Chan already mentioned, it's SDP that has a delta of 22%. It's then the PAP that has a delta of 20%, and then it's WP which has a delta of 15%. So I think, we recognize this completely, and it's SDP that had the best shift upwards, in other words. And I'm very glad to have had the time to clarify, and very, very glad that, Prof. Chan, you highlighted those issues. So we should look at mean scores just as a quick way of grasping the overview, but then we should take the time to go through all the percentages. We've given that to you in the handbook, and if you look at the appendices, we've given you all the charts for you to work out. And this then cuts to Mr. Kwek's question on methodology. So what we've done in our survey is to randomly select people out of the phone book, which is the landline. Right? And so what we've done is to give you, in the back of your handbook as well, our methodology and how we needed to weight the sample because we had a shortfall of people in certain categories. So we've highlighted there that we had shortfalls in people of the ages 40 to 65 and above. Right? Those bands were short. When we compare the ages, citizen ages that is available in the data from the document called Population in Brief 2015, we should have had 30% in the 40 to 54 category, 30%, but we had, it's not a shortfall, we actually had 34 instead. But the shortfall happens in the 55 to 64 category, where we had 18% when we should have had 20% of our survey of our sample in that category. And in the oldest age group, as Mr. Kwek had sort of had a hunch about, we only 14% of our sample were in that oldest category when they should have been 17%. So we had to weight the data up for that. And as a result, when we done the weighting, these are some of the categories where we had a shortfall in after, when you've got the weighted sample profile, we've handed that out to you, and you can work it out vis-a-vis resident population, because we don't have the citizen population breakdown for, say for instance, for classes, occupational classes. But if you compare that to resident, we have a shortfall for working class. We have a shortfall when you compare to educational categories, PSLE and below. And then we have a shortfall in the higher income group of 7K and above, where we oversampled based on our weighted sample profile, again, vis-a-vis not citizen data, resident data. Our oversampling, we had an oversampling of those in the service class, 2K to 6K categories for 6.999 household income category, and also the category of secondary and diploma and university grads. Again, you know, we're limited. So if you take the resident population data as an indicator, then those are the precise categories where we recognize that there are shortfalls or oversampling. The question of language, yes, we did translate to Malay and Tamil. Okay, so that's to reach as many as possible, but not dialects at all. I think that covers it, Chairman.
As you all can tell, right? Is it on?
Oh, maybe I'll just add one in before you figure out the mic. And our data is good for plus and minus 2.2% at 95% confidence interval. Okay, just wrap it up.
Okay, let me try. As you all can tell, you know, survey research is not a perfect science. You know, there are all kinds of limitations, and we are always trying to get at the truth as close as we can. There are statistical ways of doing it. There are also practical ways of doing it. And if I have my way, all right, if I have my way, actually I'll prefer to draw a sample from DOS, the Department of Statistics, and then work with that sample. But in this case, we use a panel that's developed by YouGov, and it is sort of representative of Singaporean voters. It's got all the age groups, it's got all the educational levels and all that, and we do the necessary weighting, right, to try to get at to arrive at a population that is somewhat similar to that of the Singapore population of voters. But having said that, I know in my presentation, I did say that, you know, we've got to make a few intellectual leap here and there, right? And but of course, at the end of the day, what really matters is whether do we have a story that is logical, plausible, and does sort of gel with the reality that we know. And I'm sure if you look at my set of data, you probably can come up with maybe a slightly different conclusion even, and I'm not surprised at all. So, but just be rest assured that we try, I mean, we don't fudge the data, we don't try and make it fit our preferred opinion, our preferred position. All right, we just let the data stand and then we interpret it the best we can, right? But of course, someone else can come along and find something else.
Thanks. And really the system of survey design and weightings are quite consistent internationally when it comes to poll studies. All right, so let's take 3 more questions. Would you please keep your questions brief? Also, could you just identify yourself and also your affiliation? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Koh Kim Sang, simply an overaged student without a head for quantitative matters. But qualitatively, from what I've seen, it occurs to me actually that the voters who are actually in the upper age groups, 55 and so on, they seem to be very happy with the existing condition. They do not appear to want to rock the boat. My curiosity is why that is so, because as I talk to various people at various levels of strata of society, I find that the happiness index is not as nice as what's reflected in the statistics which have been shown. So the question is, how is it whereas the younger fellows are all, you know, ready, willing to change the system and so on, the older chaps are rather staid and happy, don't want to rock the boat. Is it because experience has shown them, you know, that there's this thing called the unseen hand, as you know. And so we better stay quiet, be happy with what we have, you know. And so that's reflected over there.
Thank you.
I'm curious, it's good if you have the opportunity to look at this, because the happiness index doesn't appear to tie in with the existing condition, you see.
Thank you
Thanks very much.
Gentlemen. Walter.
Hi, Walter De Ferra, Sim University. So I wanted to compare and contrast the two results, the survey's two results a bit. Okay, so I think Dr. Koh's survey suggests that generally support for pluralism in Singapore is drawn more from higher socioeconomic class citizens. Now, on the other hand, I think Professor Tan's survey suggests that voting support for the People's Action Party is actually very strong among people in the higher socioeconomic class in Singapore, among people who are basically very well educated and people who are earning lots of money and living in private property. So I wonder if what this suggests is that the space the opposition has to contest in Singapore is actually very narrow. Why is it narrow? It's because on the one hand, the people most inclined to give them a try are actually people who are well educated and quite wealthy. On the other hand, the policies they're proposing generally actually harm the economic interests of this group, which is maybe why they're supporting the PAP in such a large extent. So I wonder if you could comment on these issues a bit, because it'd be interesting to compare the results from the two surveys in a couple of ways. Thank you.
Walter, did you say calm the economic interests? I couldn't hear that word.
Yeah, I said, sorry. Generally, the opposition policies tend to harm the economic interests of the richest in Singapore.
Thank you.
Hi, very good morning to all of you, and thanks for the data. Interesting. Lim Lai Cheng from SMU. I've been in the mainstream education system for the last 28 years, and I just want to offer one point for your consideration when we zoom in on the group that is age 20 to 29 and why they're more supportive now of the government, of the existing government than before. In 1996, we introduced national education. So if you count 20 years back, plus the time when this large group was P1 till now, they're like within your age of 20 to 29. I'm not saying that they enjoyed the propaganda, but the messaging and the rhetoric will stay with you as with our national pledge and anthem, whether you like it or not. And the messages would be incorruptibility, meritocracy, racial harmony, etc., but no one owes Singapore a living. We ourselves have to defend Singapore. So I guess that could give you some clue as to why this generation that's voting between 20 to 29, they grew up with that from primary one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take these three questions first, and then Vicky will go to you next.
All right. First, to Dr. Koh's question on the happiness level of the older voters. He doesn't think that they're entirely happy when he wonders why they've shifted back to supporting the status quo. So may I just invite you to look at slide 60, which is in your handbook, and this gives you the cluster analysis on the basis of age. I think my short answer really is that happiness is relative, so it's a question of who is relatively less unhappy than happy, and relatively, okay, so are we looking at slide 60? So if you take a look at those who are in 65 years and above, and what we are trying to do is look at the shifts between 2006 to 2011 to 2015. So what are the changes? And if the findings of our 2006 survey are anything to go by, then you look at the conservative support among the 65 and above respondents, you'll find that 39.4% of them would be in the support political status quo category. And that dipped to 27.6% in 2011. And therefore, the finding in the survey for 2011 was that that was one key segment that shifted away from supporting political status quo. Then you see the shift right up. Okay, it's a 31% shift, right up to 59.3% in this age group, being categorized as conservatives in 2015. So they shifted up, and there was a shift in all the other age groups, but it was the largest shift from 2011 to 2015. What did the government introduce? What did the government do from 2011 to 2015? We call to mind the policies to improve the monetization of housing assets, the incentives for hiring older workers through the special employment credit, the change in re-employment law, the reform of CPF policy to, among other things, improve the interest payment to the smaller balances, and finally, while announced but only just implemented this month, MediShield Life, which deals with the biggest worry of the oldest voters among us, healthcare cost. We've only had the first cohort of seniors enjoy what is called CPF Life, which is payments out every month till their final day. So I think that with all that, it must have resulted in some political bounce within this segment from political bounce in the conservative category. Now to the question on the younger voters, I'm very glad that Dr. Lim was in the house to remind us about the process of citizen socialization in the National Education Program. But we must look at the changes, and we're highlighting the changes. So now cast your eye to the box for 21 to 29-year-old voters. Of course, the 21-year-olds are new voters, but we also have people up to 29. Look at, theirs is different. Their shift is with the pluralist box. In 2006, 34.7 in that category were pluralists, and look at the huge swing up to 50.5% in 2011. And then the steepest decline, the largest gradient, the biggest gradient, down to 25.8% in the pluralist box in that category. It's a delta of 24.7%. So it's a suggestion that the 29-year-olds, never benefited from national education. But we're still looking at those shifts. So I hope, Chairman, I responded to some of the issues that were raised. Thank you.
Prof. Tan will talk about Walter's question. Yeah.
Earlier I said that survey research is not a perfect science. Right now I'm going to give you another soundbite, which is that the demographics are actually very complex. I mean, people are divided in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, class, and even class is indicated. I mean, you can use different indicators like house type, income, education, and occupation. So in order to be able to say, okay, age 20 to 29 are like that, and the higher class are like that, it's really hard actually, unless you can look at all the dimensions. See, very often when we look at only one dimension, we don't really get it, because it could be young and poor, or it could be old and rich, or whatever. There are different combinations. So when I look at my data set, one of the things I realized is that it's very hard to ascertain a pattern. In fact, the only thing that I was willing to emphasize in my presentation is I noticed that there's something consistent about age 30 to 39, but the rest are not willing to concede, not at this point in time. So if you were to look at the data that we have produced, released to you, I mean, look at it very carefully. You notice that it's very hard to find a pattern in some of the tables. And that's the reason why I decided not to dwell too much on them. And I only dwell on the top line data.
Thank you.
Can I jump in to answer Walter's question very quickly? So when you look at the policies that were introduced by the PAP from 2011, your suggestion is that their policies have harmed the upper class, upper middle class. And so the question is, how do they gain support? Go ahead.
No, sorry, that's not what I said. What I said was that for the opposition,
yes.
On the one hand, you have a set of results which suggest, right, that basically they're getting a lot of potential support from people who are more well-educated, people who are richer. But on the other hand, the people who actually voted for the PAP are actually quite heavily drawn from people who are well-educated and rich. And the problem the opposition parties have is that on the one hand, they've got natural support from this group. On the other hand, the policies the opposition propose actually harms this group.
Yeah.
It's not the People's Action Party policies which actually harm the rich, you know. It's the
So-
proposed policies of the opposition if
Yeah.
they got into power.
Right. So I was going to say that with the PAP, it cuts the ground from under, you know, the opposition parties. I think we've had this data out. We've had 2 rounds, and the opposition parties do gain their support the higher the socio-economic class. But then on the flip side, when you look at their manifestos, they don't actually say much or appeal much to that category. In fact, their, you know, various policies in their manifestos do harm that group as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Keiki first, and then Prof. Ann.
Hi, good morning. My name is Keiki. I'm from NUS. I have 2 questions. First is regarding the sections that you asked what influenced their vote. So given that SG50 and all the celebrations were such a big thing this year, it's interesting that you didn't really include it in the analysis. And also, given the spike in 2011 that you pointed out just now, is it possible that it's because a lot of people across age groups were actually first-time voters in 2011, and they started thinking a bit more in 2015? Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Ann? And we.
Thank you. I'll never be in your survey because I'm ex-directory. But my question is, if I was in Britain and voting for the opposition, my message would be, I want this party to take over the government. Now, is there a kind of consensus here that if I vote for the opposition, I want to stir things up a bit and have more plurality? Would any of the opposition voters be wanting their party to take over the government? That's my question.
Thank you. Please, one more question if somebody has that. Yeah, Ori.
Okay, sorry, this is a bit. I'm Ori from a company called S2T. My question is maybe a bit difficult, but I just going to ask anyway. You have a lot of questions, a lot in both surveys. Which one of them can have predictive value? Okay, which one has the best predictive value? Meaning, just to clarify, let's say I would ask this question 1 year before the elections, but not ask what you're going to vote. Is any of these questions will allow me to do that? For example, how happy are you? Are you very happy, not happy? Meaning I'm not happy, I want to change something, and so on. Thank you.
All right, it's 3 questions.
All right, there are 3 questions. The first one is about SG50, right? We did not ask people whether has it got any impact on their decision, but I'm sure it's somewhere in the background. It's somewhere there. And usually, even in a survey, right, we don't ask people a direct question like, does SG50 have an impact on their decision? We don't. We just maybe ask them whether they are aware of it, how important it is, and then look at how they voted, and then we find the correlation, and then maybe say something about the causal relation. But we never ask them a direct question about, does it have impact on your decision? That's number 1. And on Henry's question about when you vote for the opposition, right? I think in Singapore, what it means is you want diversity and you want pluralism. I don't think you're talking about new government, as you correctly pointed out. And then as for predictive value, in my survey, I think the only variable which I'm willing to put my money on is about confidence in the party. I think that, to me, is predictive.
Gillian?
Okay. Yeah, in the same way, we do try to be subtle about it. So we were hoping that the term, the LKY legacy, you know, would remind people that it's SG50, also that he passed on, and there was a lot of media coverage of what, you know, he meant, but also how far Singapore has come over the last 50 years. So we put that in. But, you know, for us, there are some key items that we keep in place because that's the item that we're tracking. And we're trying to see if, you know, any of the historically specific items can detract or trump or kick out any of the key items that we're looking for. And I highlighted those as need for diverse views, checks and balances, and things like that. So, you know, that's how we view it. And I've also given you the segments of data for whom the LKY legacy, which is a proxy for the whole SG effect, mattered. So it's all there. Young voters, unfortunately, this time around, we really did not have a grasp, and I have not worked out how many voters went to the polling booth because they had turned 21 since 2011. So I'm not able to answer that question because I can't compare it with how many voters went to the polling booths in 2011 for the first time because they had turned 21. So can't respond to that one. Yeah, taking over the government, that's the thing. I hope that, maybe in a few years' time, our cluster analysis would be absolutely obsolete because there will be parties that say, I'm here to really run and take over the government tomorrow. Because it doesn't come out as a strong message, we are still having to feel our way around. We never ask straightforward questions, but we try to be oblique about it and try and form a composite picture through our cluster analysis. And so our items are really, do you need checks and balances? Do you always find it's absolutely important to have elected opposition members in parliament and also diverse views? So we use that as not an extreme case because we don't think people will respond to the extreme case, but we use this as a way to feel about whether Singaporeans generally want greater political competition. And if they do to such force, eventually that will give us some indication, predictive value, as to whether the time has come for a different opposition movement to emerge. And what our data has shown this year is it is far from being that case. Not because the parties haven't campaigned on that, because the governing party has done something. I don't know, you'll have to discuss it, but maybe it's not in people's minds at the moment. So now to Ori's question on predictive value, I think our colleagues will show you another set of data which suggests that if you include all the respondents, 2,000 of them, 47.3% of those respondents said they had decided on who to vote for before nomination day. Yeah. So in fact, if you did the poll a few days before election is called, it would completely, I mean, it just shows you whether the campaign matters or not. So what we aim to do with our data is to provide the segments so that you, academics, as well as the political actors can have a grasp of which of the segments of Singaporeans are responding to which issues, which messages, from where. And they can then plan their strategies from that. I think it's not prediction, it's deciding, setting a strategy and making that happen for whichever party, XYZ party, yeah.
Thank you. We've come to the end of the time allocated for this session. I'm sure you've gleaned a lot from this, the speakers, so could you join me to thank them for their contribution this morning.
Thank you, Mathew.